Uh, Welcome everyone to the Tick Talk. My name's Andrew Scott. I'm the Bush Care Officer with North Sydney Council. I have Gareth Debney, the Bushland Management Coordinator, with me to help run this session and to answer questions for Council at the end of the talk. We are running this Tick Talk because in recent years we've had an increasing incidence of tick bite in some of our reserves, and so we thought it prudent that we should start looking out for everyone's health, those health implications. And when I was asking around, particularly with a group called ARBA, the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators, I was referred to Stephen Doggett from Westmead Hospital. And when I read his bio in a minute, you'll see why we've invited him along. I would encourage you to ask questions via the chat function as we go along, rather than waiting until the end, so we don't, so we can finish this presentation at a reasonable time. All right, let's go. Well, I'd like to welcome Stephen L. Doggett. He's the Director of the Department of Medical Entomology at Westmead Hospital in Sydney, Australia. He has over 39 years' experience in the field of medical entomology, produced over 830 papers and presented close to 500 lectures at local and international conferences. He is the world authority on bedbugs, the leading Australian expert on ticks and their management, and a renowned mosquito researcher and insect photographer. Stephen is the chief editor of A Code of Practice for the Control of Bedbug Infestations in Australia, Advances in the Biology and Management of Modern Bedbugs, the first bedbug book textbook in 50 years, and the Global Federation of the Asian and Oceanic Pest Managers Association magazine. Stephen is the only dual recipient of the Australian Environmental Pest Managers Association's Award for Excellence for services to the Australian pest management industry, being presented with the honour in 2012 and again in 2022. Stephen is the only person to serve on both national tick committees, tick-induced allergies, research and awareness, and the Clinical Advisory Committee on Lyme Disease in Australia. Welcome, Stephen. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And I love all those names that you read out. They're very easy to read, weren't they? Very smoothly done. I can't do it either, so don't feel too bad. So I'll just share screen and I will just start off my presentation. So thank you, everybody. And I'm hoping that you can see the big screen. Can you confirm that, Andrew? Is that a no or is it yes? Sorry, you turn your microphone off. That's a no, is it? Okay, so I'll try again.
Yeah, no, Stephen.
Okay, so bear with me, folks. Sorry.
Yep, here we go.
Okay, we've got it now.
Just in slideshow.
Oh, it's just slideshow. Oh,
I put it in slideshow, yeah.
Sorry, I just swap screens. Bear with me.
It's that little icon on the top brown bar there.
No, it's on. I've got two screens here, and that's my problem. I've just got to get the other. Swap the screen around, which we did before.
Yep,
and I'll try it again. And I would have to swap things around, wouldn't I? Learn my lesson.
Yeah, okay. That's good.
Okay, you've got it now, full screen.
All right, I'll mute myself.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you again, Andrew, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone. So I'd like to thank Andrew for the kind invitation to speak on one of my favourite topics, namely ticks. However, it's also one of the most challenging topics that we can speak on because there's so much misinformation around ticks, from how to remove them, about their biology, about their control, and a lot of misinformation about this really non-entity called Lyme disease in Australia, which sadly has been pushed by some ethically questionable people in the medical community that has led to exploitation of some patients, which is quite sad. And I'll talk and touch about that topic later on. So to give an overview of this presentation, I'll start by just giving a general discussion on ticks, but most of this presentation will be focusing on one species, the Australian paralysis tick, Ixodes holocyclus. And that, as you'll see later, is by far the most common tick that you're likely to encounter in Eastern Australia. I'll talk about its biology, its life cycle, its ecology. Then I'll go on to talk about how it can make you sick, the clinical impacts associated with the bite of the paralysis tick. And of course, it's probably better to avoid being bitten in the first place. So I'll talk about how to avoid ticks, talk about repellents. And a lot of people are concerned about the safety of many of the repellents out there, particularly those that contain DEET. And I'll put the safety in the context of risk compared to other phenomena that you may come across. And finally, I'll talk about tick removal. As I said, there's a lot of misinformation around ticks. This talk is really based on science and published science, and that will form the basis of the information in this presentation. So when it comes to ticks, there are about 800 species in the world, and we don't have a particularly great tick fauna in Australia, with about 75 species and around 15 have been reported attacking humans. But by far the most important in Eastern Australia is Ixodes holocyclus, known as the Australian paralysis tick, also called the scrub tick, the bush tick. The male is often called the shellback for reasons that become apparent. Or the tiny juvenile stage, the larval stage, is often called the seed tick or grass tick because they're very small and they're seed-like. And this species occurs along east coast of Australia in a very disjointed distribution, really confined to more natural habitats. So less disturbed forests. So we don't see in the middle of Sydney because we don't have the forests and we don't have the native host that the tick requires. And Andrew mentioned before how we're seeing a dramatic increase in the incidence of tick bite. And there's a number of reasons for that, but two main reasons. One, we've had a series of wet years, and wet years is great for ticks, but also because of the amount of fox baiting that's gone on over recent years. By controlling foxes, it means that native animals have come back, which is great. But with native animals coming back, there's more hosts for the ticks to feed on. And so it's a bit of a double whammy, which is unfortunate. So we'll move on to the creature herself. And I say herself because this is the adult female paralysis tick. Now, isn't she so lovely? I think she's quite gorgeous. I'll point out a few features, and mindful of the delays with Zoom. So this is the adult paralysis tick, the most deadly of all the stages. So the first thing to notice is two pairs of 4 legs, so 8 legs in total. And there's 2 main body parts. We've got the body and we've got the head. On the body, there's a thumb-like structure called the scutum. This is a hardened structure, so if the tick's attached to an animal and the animal scratches itself, it won't damage the tick or just bounce off. Behind the scutum is a membrane, which actually unfolds as it feeds. Now, just remember the size of the scutum relative to the body. And I'll come back to that point later on. Then the other major part we've got is the head. And on the head, there are 2 palps on either side of a central structure. And I'll show a close-up of this later on. But the central structure is called a hypostome, which is what is inserted into the skin. And you'll see 2 depressions just on the head. These are not eyes. In fact, the paralysis tick doesn't actually have eyes. And if ticks have eyes, then the eyes are located on the scutum, right on the edge of the scutum where the arrow is pointing. But these depressions are called the porose areas, where various chemicals are released, such as UV blocking compound, which the female then places on the eggs. So like all good mums, she puts block out on her children. Isn't that nice? I think it is. So we'll move on to the other adult, and that's the male. And the male looks like a very different creature indeed. And there's a couple of very obvious features that are different. One is that the head is much shorter. So the hypostome, the part that goes into the skin, is very short, simply because it doesn't blood feed. And if a male wants a drink, he actually attaches to the female and parasitizes the female. And sometimes you'll collect adult female ticks that are fully engorged, and you see this series of brown dots underneath, and that's where a male's attached. The other distinctive feature is that the scutum covers the whole body, and it does so basically to prevent dehydration. The one role that the male has in life for the tick is to find the female. I guess a lot of men would probably think that too, but we won't go there. So it's a very different creature indeed. So here we have 4 of the 5 stages. The only stage that's missing is the egg stage, which basically is a round little egg and not very distinctive. But we have the adult female, the adult male, the nymphal stage, and the tiny larval stage. As you can see, you can compare it to a 1 millimeter bar. The larvae is very tiny indeed. And the larvae, the nymph, look very similar to the adult. The main difference with the larvae is that it's got 3 pairs of legs. So it's got 6 legs in total. One thing that is very distinctive about the paralysis tick is that the different life stages show a distinct seasonality. So when it's extremely hot during the summer months, the tick survives as the egg stage. Then during the autumn months, the larvae hatch out. Then the nymphs become active during the winter months, and the adult is most active during the spring months. And for a larvae to hatch, to develop to a nymphal stage, and if a nymphal stage to develop into an adult stage, they need blood for nutrition. And for an adult stage, they require blood to gain protein to produce eggs. And of course, it's this blood feeding behavior where they come in contact with us and cause us problems. To give you an idea of the extent of the seasonality of the three main stages, at Westmead Hospital, we have a pathology service for the identification of insects and arthropods of medical importance. In fact, we are the de facto national reference laboratory in Australia, and we receive more specimens in this area than any other laboratory. Around 4 years ago, my partner Marilyn, who's listening in, and I, Marilyn used to work here before she retired, and another listener, Karen, who's also online. Hi, Karen. So we actually decided to look at the specimens over the last 30 years or 30 years previous and tally up the number of specimens that we've received. And so we plotted the number of specimens submitted by month. And so here, what we've got in this graph is the number of specimens of, first of all, the larval stage of the paralysis tick submitted by month. And you can see there's this real peak in March. So we're coming into the larval tick season very soon. Then nymphs peak in July, and the adult season really peaks in October, November. But you see a little bit of carryover with all stages. And so you've got to be aware that the adult tick is certainly the most dangerous, but you can come across it at any time of the year. But the numbers peak during those spring months. In this particular slide, it just shows you the range of tick species that have been reported biting humans as submitted to our pathology service. And you can see how Ixodes holocyclus just dominates. Now, if our laboratory was in the Western Australia, then it would probably be the second tick, Amblyoma trigutatium, that would dominate. It's a species that occurs west of the Great Dividing Range, very common, particularly in Western Australia. Very different species. Is a species that's an active hunter. So if you sit down in one spot, it will come to you, whereas holocyclus doesn't do that, as you'll hear shortly. I have one of these species, Ixodes ornithorynchi, in red, because that was actually the first report ever of this species biting humans. And for those of you that know your species name, you may actually recognize that species name. It's named after platypus. And so a lady was bitten by ticks that normally attack platypus. She was a platypus handler. And so she had the honor of being the first in the world to be bitten by Ixodes ornithorynchi. Something she can tell and brag about to her friends. Here we just compared the number of patients sending specimens. Slightly higher number of males reported paralysis ticks than females. I'm guessing this probably represents outdoor activity, be it recreational or work. Perhaps more men work in the environment than women. I don't know. I can't think of any other explanation. If you've got another one, please let me know. But one thing that is important to note is that the highest number of specimens came off young children. And young children are especially vulnerable to the paralysis effects of ticks. And most of the people who die from tick paralysis in the past were actually children under 10. And that's a very important point. So if you do go out into a tick-prone area, you come back, do go over your young child, particularly around through the hair, and that can be a real problem. And I'll talk a little bit about more of that later on. So you remember that earlier image of the adult paralysis tick and how that scutum, that thumb-like structure where I've got my arrow, basically covered half the body. But here we've got a fully engorged paralysis tick, and she's basically turned into an egg production factory. And so once she's dropped off the host, her sole role is to lay the eggs, and she'll lay in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 eggs during the lifetime, and then she'll wither up and die. So it's a short life for these creatures. They live for about a year, and that's it. Interestingly, once the eggs are in the environment, then the eggs will hatch out over a relatively short period. And when you think you've got 2,000 to 3,000 eggs, that basically these paralysis tick, all they do, they don't actively hunt. All they do is when they search for a host is climb the nearest vegetation. And they sit there and they have a behavior called questing, where they put their front legs out and they just hold them out. And they wait for something big and hairy to come along, which they just grab. And so if you think you've got 2,000 to 3,000 eggs that have hatched out, and you've got 100 to 200 larvae on a blade of grass, you can see why that if you brush that blade of grass, you can get tens or even hundreds of larval ticks on you. It's pretty rare that you get one larval tick. Usually you get a number to lots. I've had up to 200 at one time when I was doing a lot of tick collecting. And on the front pair of legs is a structure called the Haller's organ. And it's a pit which has got full of hairs, and it can detect moisture, it can detect heat, so it detect the body temperature of warm-blooded animals, which the tick feeds on. It can detect movement, and it can detect carbon dioxide. And as I said, the tick basically just sits there and waits for something big and hairy to walk past, whether it's that hairy git on the right, and I can call him a hairy git because it's me, some 34 years ago. God, it's hard to believe I've been in this field for that long. Where does that time go? Or the other thing it may attach to is to that incredibly technical and very complex piece of equipment that I'm dragging around, which looks like a flag, and we call it a flag. And it's a piece of material on a bit of wood. And it actually simulates an animal walking past. And so you wave that over the vegetation, and these questing ticks will just latch onto it. And that's a way we collect unengorged ticks. That's the most effective way. And it's really the only way we can collect paralysis tick, unless we're collecting ticks via trapping animals. But if we want unengorged ticks for research or other purposes, that's the way we do it. And so what's happened here, this is a close-up of the flag, where I've passed over a spot where larval ticks are. And so, as I said, all these larval ticks hatch out, they hang in the one spot. And so these are all brothers and sisters. And there are actually 165 larval ticks here. I counted them. And so you can see how you can end up with a lot of larval ticks on you at one time. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about ticks, as I mentioned, and one is about host-seeking behaviour. I remember there was this rather eccentric guy who used to be on the northern beaches. He passed away some years ago, who said, "Oh, you'd see the larval ticks fall out of the tree." Well, he had the cataracts the size of plates, and so I didn't believe one word of him. And there's just no evidence that they do that. In fact, larval ticks are so tiny, there's no way you would see them falling out of a tree. All the research says that once the host searching or host seeking stage emerges, it doesn't, they don't move very far in the vegetation. Barely 1.5 meters either side, and they barely go half a meter high in the vegetation. And the reason why they don't climb very high is they're really susceptible to desiccation. Water controls activity, water controls their population. And so over the last 3 years, we've had extremely wet years. And when you get wet years, you get greater tick numbers. You go back to 2019-20, you didn't see many ticks that year because it was so dry. So ticks don't move very far in the vegetation. So when are ticks most active? Well, most of the year except during those hot summer months. And as I said, the survival's dependent on humidity. Their distribution is dependent on host. So in the middle of Sydney, we don't have the native animals, largely bandicoots. And so we don't have ticks in the middle of Sydney. It's also too dry. And we can think about that information. We can even use it for tick control too, which I'll touch on later on. But ticks are most active, and the paralysis tick I'm talking about, remember, following rain with high humidity. And if you want a really bad tick period, you've got a few days heavy rain, then the habitat dries out, it's still overcast, and suddenly during the spring months, the veterinary practices will be inundated with paralysis about 4 to 5 days to 8 days later, with dogs with severe paralysis. And that's the time when you're at most risk if you go into these tick-prone habitats. The larval stage is far more common simply because you've got all these ticks, juvenile ticks that have emerged and they're sitting on the vegetation. If no animal brushes past that, they all die. So there's very high rates of mortality from the larval stage to the next stage. And so larval tick numbers are very high and much higher than at any other stage. So what do ticks do to you? Like all blood-sucking arthropods and insects, the first thing they do is they put these mouth parts into you, and then they go, they spit into you. And the saliva contains all these different compounds, various proteins, and a very important carbohydrate that I'll come to shortly. But some of these proteins can be toxic, some can be allergenic. And one particular toxin, holocyclotoxin, is known to cause paralysis. So it's no surprise that the paralysis tick causes paralysis, is it? And there were past human deaths. From 1925 to 1945, there were some 20 human deaths. 70% were young children. But because of modern medicine, life support, ventilators, people don't die now. And also we have a very effective antivenin. But tick paralysis in dogs is still common. A lot of animals, a lot of our pets die. Although these products, your spot-ons and your systemic products that you can give to your animal, are very effective at reducing tick paralysis. In fact, there used to be a lot more companies that produce antivenin than there is now. Ticks worldwide transmit a huge range of bacteria, viruses, protozoans, and other pathogens. But in Australia, we're largely free of infectious diseases. And the only one to really be of concern is one that's called Queensland tick typhus. Queensland tick typhus, at least in our region anyway. There are others, but that's the most important, transmitted by Rickettsia australis. And it produces a disease called spotted fever rickettsia, which produces a spotted fever. So if you get bitten by a tick and you develop some sort of spotted rash all over your body and you get a higher temperature, go off to your GP for a dose of doxycycline for 7 to 10 days. and you will recover pretty quick. However, if you don't get antibiotics, you can die. It is potentially lethal. There hasn't been many deaths too that I'm aware of. It's not as deadly as some of the other rickettsias, but do keep an eye out for those symptoms. And if you get any symptoms after being bitten by a tick, by all means, just make sure you go to your GP and get clinically assessed. By far the most important clinical impact in terms of humans is allergic reactions. And this is quite a complex area. It can be from mild symptoms to severe and even anaphylaxis, and even severe anaphylaxis and death. And I'll talk about this more shortly. But the other allergic reaction that's become very apparent is mammalian meat allergy. First recognized in the world by this astonishing person, Associate Professor Cheryl Van Noonen, who's a name that you'll hear more in this talk. But I wanted to touch on the thorny issue of Lyme disease. In many ways, Lyme disease parallels the anti-vax groups, the anti-climate change lobby. It's really an anti-science group. But to go back to the beginnings of Lyme disease, the word Lyme comes after the town of Lyme in the US, in Connecticut. And so an epidemiologist by the name of Alan Steer was called in to investigate a cluster of rheumatoid arthritis in children. And lo and behold, this condition was described, and it was called Lyme disease after the town was first described. And then there was a race around the world to become the first to diagnose Lyme disease in particular areas and in particular countries. And clearly this resulted in forced diagnosis, which is a real problem we've seen. It is caused by a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi, and there's a number of bacteria that belong to this group, and they've got different species names. Now, the thing about Lyme disease, you can't diagnose Lyme disease based on symptoms only, because the symptoms are so similar to many other diseases in the world. You need blood tests, and blood tests that either look for antibodies to the pathogen, or that we attempt to isolate the bacteria through various molecular means or via various cultural means. Unfortunately, misdiagnosis of Lyme disease has been extremely common in Australia. And unfortunately, there are dubious groups that are willing to take your money and give you a positive diagnosis. And there's groups I know of, pathology laboratories, that will charge you literally thousands of dollars for reagents and chemicals that may cost under $10, where they perform these tests, no different to what's done in Australia, where you can get the test done for free through Medicare. And invariably, they always come back positive. And they come back positive so that you get another blood test, and so you get charged another, $1,000 to $2,000. Unfortunately, there is this dark side to Lyme disease. And I'll talk a bit about the evidence for Lyme disease in Australia. Now, let's look at the vectors of Lyme disease. A vector is a creature that transmits something. In this case, the ticks that transmit Lyme disease. In Europe, all the ticks that transmit Lyme disease, and in America, belong to what's called the Ixodes persicales complex. These are commonly called black-legged ticks. Why? Because they've got black legs. Surprise, surprise. In the US, it includes Ixodes scapularis, in Europe, Ixodes ricinus, and in Eastern Europe, Russia, Japan, Ixodes persicales. We do not have any black-legged ticks. The most common tick that bites humans, as you've already heard, is the paralysis tick. So can Ixodes holocyclis transmit the Lyme disease bacteria? And two very important and two extremely prominent scientists, in fact, our most important tick researcher ever, Bernie Stone, along with Joe Peisman, two great scientists who I had the privilege to know and meet, sadly no longer with us, tested the ability for our tick to transmit Lyme disease. What they found was that simply it wouldn't happen. Our tick could not transmit the bacteria. So Ixodes holocyclis is not a vector. So Australia doesn't have the vector of the disease. And really, all discussions of Lyme disease should have stopped then. we shouldn't have even considered Lyme disease anymore. I mean, if you don't have the vector, you don't have the disease. A parallel relates to the tropical disease dengue virus transmitted by mosquitoes. Do we have dengue in Sydney? No, because we don't have the vector, Aedes aegypti. Well, we don't have the vector for Lyme disease, yet various groups were still diagnosing Lyme disease patients based on very questionable blood tests. And so various researchers looked for evidence of Lyme disease occurring in Australia. And one of the first groups was Richard Russell with Rosemary Munro, who employed a then young scientist, who's now a very old scientist, who's speaking to you today, me, where I collected some 12,000 ticks and tested them, oops, I pressed the wrong button, via various means. So we used what's called dark field microscopy. I won't go into it. We attempted to isolate the bacteria, and we used molecular means to detect evidence of the bacteria. What we found was what was called spirochete-like objects. Sadly, another group in Australia doing similar research to us, found these objects as well and claimed they were the cause for Lyme disease in Australia. And we know that was wrong. It was totally wrong what they said. And what they were artifacts of the culturing process. And in our paper that was published in a very prestigious medical journal or epidemiological infection, we concluded there was no definitive evidence for Lyme disease in Australia. Yet there was various GPs and individuals that still claim Lyme disease was around. It prompted a Senate inquiry. Money was provided by the government. And it really culminated in this piece of work, the most intelligent and the most definitive research on Lyme disease that's ever been done in Australia. And it was done by a veterinary researcher, Peter Irwin from Murdoch University in West Australia. And Peter is actually the head of the former head of the veterinary school. And I've done a bit of work with Peter over the years. We know that dogs are good indicators for the presence of Lyme disease. Why? Well, think of them. You know, they're running around the bush, they're hide of a tick, and they get a lot of ticks on them. And generally, dogs tend to have a seropositive rate, so they're positive to the disease about 5 times out of humans because of their behavior running through the bush and such. And so what Peter did, which was so incredibly smart, is he tested these anti-venin dogs. So basically there's these dogs, and these dogs have ticks put on them. And so they become hyperimmune to the tick paralysis. The dogs are then bled, their sera is extracted, and that's what is put into your pet if your pet develops paralysis from a tick bite. So they're hyperimmune creatures. And so that's basically how tick antivenin is produced. And so he tested 84 dogs, and these dogs had, during their lifetime, more than 150,000 adult female paralysis ticks placed on them. If these were going to be positive for Lyme disease, if Lyme disease was going to be in Australia, then these dogs would be positive. And do you want to know how many were actually positive? 0. This is definitive evidence that Lyme disease does not occur in Australia. And there's other research I haven't mentioned. Lyme disease simply does not occur in Australia, full stop. There is not one credible piece of evidence for the disease in Australia. But what is very real and what is very serious is tick-induced allergies. And this can be quite variable. It can be skin reactions. It can be very mild. So we often talk about scrub itch or grass itch, where we get bitten by the larval stage. And here we've got this chap, and you can see all these sort of red dots on his back. And basically, these are all spots from larval ticks. And this particular guy, he occasionally goes out tick collecting, and he never puts repellent on because well, you could say he's a bit stupid, but it's because he doesn't want the repellent actually on any equipment that he's collecting. That is actually me, I should say. But in some cases, we see large allergic reactions, often within 4 to 12 hours of the bite. And so here we've got a fellow that used to work downstairs from me. He used to live at Dural. I don't know, I haven't seen him for a long time. But he got bitten on the upper arm. You can see that spot on the upper arm, and his whole, much of his arm just swelled up. And he's becoming hypersensitive to the tick bite. And he's at real risk of developing anaphylaxis, which could become life-threatening. And we know of at least 4 fatalities due to tick-induced anaphylaxis. And it's a very common condition indeed, particularly in the northern beaches of New South Wales. I mentioned before, Associate Professor Cheryl Van Noonen. And if you're listening, Cheryl, hi. And thank you for allowing me to pinch your slide. I forgot to ask, very rude of me. And this is data from Cheryl's practice. So you can see that of these, this is of patients that have had anaphylaxis to various insects. So we've got 5 patients that had anaphylaxis to native wasps, Polistes wasps, 2 patients developing anaphylaxis to European wasps, 8 to bee stings, yet 258 to the paralysis tick. It is far more common than peanut allergies and even shark attack. And I'll talk more about shark attack later. So remember that. So you can just see how it's such a common problem. Yet we tend to hear more about bee sting allergy than we do tick allergies. But one of the most fascinating diseases of all, and the most extraordinary disease that I've ever come across in my life, is mammalian meat allergy. First described by Associate Professor Cheryl Van Noonen, who was then at Royal North Shore Hospital, who's now at the Northern Beaches Hospital. And it's basically an allergy to the consumption of mammalian meats. And it used to be called red meat allergy. Sometimes it's called alpha-gal allergy for reasons that become apparent. But we call it mammalian meat allergy because it's any mammalian meat, whether it's pork, sheep, moo cow. If you go to Japan, whale, go to South America, if you have guinea pig, if you have this allergy, you can develop an allergy to all those. And what happens is when a tick bites you, it injects a carbohydrate. And this is one thing that's really unusual about this condition, is that most allergies are protein-based, but this is a carbohydrate with that horrible long name, galactose alpha-1,3 galactose, which we simply call alpha-gal, and which is why it's often called alpha-gal allergy. And you can develop antibodies to this and then basically develop mammalian meat allergy. Another thing that's very unusual about it is that reaction can be delayed from 3 to maybe up to 6 to 8 hours. So it doesn't happen immediately, whereas most allergic reactions occur pretty quickly. So if I get a larval tick on me, I will know within seconds because I react so badly and so quickly. And the symptoms can include gut pain, bloating, diarrhea, and even anaphylaxis. Cheryl's aware of some 3,000 patients. Australia is the centre for mammalian meat allergy in the world, and the real centre is the northern beaches of New South Wales. And the prevalence rate, and this is a slightly old figure, Cheryl could probably update these, the latest figure, is basically more than 1 in 1,000. So it's a very high rate of a disease indeed. With the rise in both mammalian meat allergies and just general tick allergies, Cheryl Van Noonen set up this group called TIARA, Tick-Induced Allergies Research and Awareness, where she's brought on various experts, including myself, to come on board. It's a great committee. I believe we've achieved a huge amount. It's now gone on for 10 years. And there's a really great website. I'll come back to that website later, but www.tiara, like you put on your head, .org.au. Now, I've just touched on mammalian meat allergy, but there's also a dark side to it as well. So we think about mammalian meats. You see a slunk, chunk of cow, it's pretty obvious. But the problem is mammalian meat products occur in so many other things that we may not be instantly aware of, such as gelatin. We know of a case of a young boy who had mammalian meat allergy. He had a lolly, which had gelatin. he went into anaphylaxis. It's in clarifiers in pineapple juice. I mean, pineapple juice, what could be more vegetarian? Well, it's not. It's a meat product. It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's on the lubricant of tampons. That's a real problem for women with that condition. It's in drips. And I remember Cheryl and I were speaking at Mona Vale Hospital back when the emergency department was there. And this lady sitting in front said, "Oh, I had a tick anaphylaxis. Sorry, I had an anaphylaxis to my main meat allergy. Went into hospital, went into emergency, and they put a drip in her. And the drip contains gelatin. She had a second anaphylaxis. Cheery stuff. It's in a lot of vaccinations. It's in a cancer drug, cetuximab, and we're aware of fatal reactions because of it. Your heart valves are from pigs. Snake antivenin, collagen implants. It also having antibodies to alpha-gal increases the risk of coronary occlusion, so increases the risk of coronary disease. It's hard to believe this little arthropod could increase your risk of basically heart disease. It's pretty scary stuff. So let's think about trying to avoid the ill effects of ticks and how we can actually prevent their bites. Well, one is, well, don't go into tick-prone habitats. You know where ticks are. If you can avoid going to it, not very nice thing to do. And if you're a bush dinner, well, you know, it means you've got to change jobs, don't you, Andrew? So, but we can also avoid high tick periods. So if we know that there's going to be a high risk, so, you know, in March, we get weather like this, the habitat dries out, we know there's going to be a high risk after that. But we can use repellents, and I'll talk more about topical repellent soon. We can wear permethrin impregnated or permethrin treated clothing, and I'll come back to that. We can modify the habitat, and this is not good news for the bush denners amongst you. So a lot of people have tick problems in their backyard, and I've had cases where people have rung me up and say to me, listen, my son, daughter suffers very severe tick anaphylaxis. What should I do? And I say, okay, where do you live? And invariably it's northern beaches, St. Ives, somewhere, you know, a place where we all want to live. And I suggest to them, well, you know, maybe the best thing is to move. I mean, horrible thing to say, and it's not the easy advice to give, but I know people have moved to protect their children. The other thing they can do is change their backyard in a very unenvironmental way. And the best way is cement the lot. So you get as much sunlight to the ground and you make the ground as dry as possible. You reduce overhanging foliage. You keep lawns mowed. However, you can actually apply insecticides on a regular basis. And insecticides can reduce tick populations by 97%. And there's a number of chemicals on the market. Probably the best chemical is a product called bifenthrin. That is the active ingredient. It's a synthetic pyrethroid. I recommend bifenthrin because it's got a high soil binding coefficient. So where you apply it, it tends to stay there. Whereas other chemicals like permethrin and some others that are also registered for tick control, you get a bit of rain, it can wash off into the creeks and can cause fish death. And we've seen major fish deaths in the northern beaches and can kill aquatic invertebrates and insects. But I mean, that is a means of tick control, and it's quite legal to do tick control in the backyard. And there are companies that specialize in it. To reduce tick problems and adverse reactions to tick, we actually need to think how to remove the tick and how that should be done properly. So let's begin by looking at repellents. And there's a lot of repellents on the market. You've got creams, you've got pump action sprays, you've got aerosols, you've got roll-ons, and they're all effective at preventing tick bites as long as they're used correctly and as long as they've got the right active ingredient. Now, before I talk more about the actives within repellents, I just want to point out that there's a lot of gimmicks out on the market. So on the left, we've got an electrocuting device. Don't use it. On the right, we've got a device that forms a loop. And the idea is you put this loop over the tick, tighten it and pull it out. do not use that for reasons that'll become apparent. At the top, we have a citronella band. At the bottom, we have a citronella patch. They do not work. The citronella band at the top will give protection about 5 millimeters either side of the band. And so to get full body protection, you'll probably have to wear several hundred of them. But if you ever try that, please send me a photograph, because I'd love a good laugh. I think it'd be quite funny to see. The other great gimmick, and it's appalling, is these ultrasonic repellers. They do not work. And I find it sad when I've gone in veterinary practice and see these things for sale. Do not use them on your animals. Do not use them on yourself. We have research. I had a Thai student out in 2019, and we've published that research, and I can provide that information if anybody wants it. Ultrasonic repellers do not work for anything. It's one big con. They should be banned, much like those citronella patches and the bands, in my professional opinion. So let's look at the constituents within the various repellents on the market. The most common and the most widely used is a product called diethyltoluamide, more commonly shortened to DEET. One that came on the market in the early 90s is a product called picaridin. And another more recent product is lemon eucalyptus oil of lemon eucalyptus, sometimes shortened to PMD. Then there's the essential oils like citronella and melaleuca oil, and there's other, like some of the other products out there, essential oils. Now, you've got to be aware that if a company markets as being natural or organic, it doesn't mean it's safe and effective. Well, there's no such thing as a natural repellent. They've got to be extracted. They're not natural. And all these compounds are actually organic compounds. And if somebody says it's safe and effective, I'd be worried about that. In our laboratory, I had a student who was doing some repellency testing, and we don't like to put ticks on ourselves. That poses a health and safety risk, work health and safety risk. So basically, we put the ticks in a tube, we treat our hands, and we see whether the ticks climb above a line and are attracted to the hand. And that's how we test repellents these days. And so in the trial that's been published, Chudapong tested oil of lemon eucalyptus on the left, a formulation of DEET, and a formulation of picaridin on the right. And basically these three compounds work very well over 4 hours. And if you look at the middle series of columns for DEET, we're still getting 100% protection after 4 hours. And that's a very important point. Now, this particular slide is an extremely important slide, but it relates to mosquitoes, but the results and the information is very relevant to ticks. And two researchers from the University of Florida, John Day and Faradin, tested different actives, different percentage of actives at how well they repel mosquitoes. And as I said, this information is very similar to ticks. So they tested a 24% formulation of DEET, and that provided 5 hours of protection. So you're out in the bush doing 8 hours of bush gen. So this means you need to reapply your repellent twice, once before you go into the habitat and sometime during the day, maybe when you break for lunch. A 20% formulation of DEET gives 4 hours. So again, twice 2 applications. A roughly 7% formulation of DEET provides 2 hours protection. So you need to reapply that for 4 times during the day. The important point here is that the higher the concentration of DEET, the longer the protection you get. Not necessarily the better protection, but the longer protection. And the one thing that you need to do is when you're using any repellent, read the instructions. Read the instructions for reapplication times. Read the instructions from how it to be used and how it shouldn't be used. And that's a very important point. If we go to citronella, 10% citronella provided 20 minutes protection. So in your 8 hours of out in the bush, doing their regeneration, you need to apply this or reapply this 24 times. A 5% formulation gives 14 minutes protection, so you've got to apply this 32 times. And if you look at a citronella wristband, well, you get 12 seconds protection, so you need to apply that or reapply it 2,400 times while you're out there for 8 hours. That would be a bit difficult, wouldn't it? You wouldn't get much bush gen done. And so it just shows that these so-called essential oils just aren't very effective. But people say to me, Stephen, but DEET, I've heard these stories, it's not safe to use. Well, is it safe to use? The first thing you've got to think about is risk analysis. You know, I'm here speaking to you, so I don't have DEET on me. I don't have any repellent because I'm not going to be exposed to ticks. But if you're doing bush gen, you're going out there, you've got to ask yourself, what's more deadly, the repellent that you're using or the tick if it bites you? And I can clearly say unequivocally, it's a tick. There's no doubt the adverse reaction from tick outweighs the risk from some remote possibility of an adverse reaction from the repellent by millions of times. So you have to ask yourself, what's worse, the bites or repellents, the ticks? DEET was first registered in 1957, developed by the American military. It's been used, I said billions, it's trillions of times by now. It is recommended by the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Protection in the US. In fact, it's the only product that's been recommended by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the US. The US Environmental Protection Agency has calculated that if used according to label directions, adverse reactions are 1 in 100 million. That's adverse reactions. That's any adverse reaction. That's actually 4 times the population of Australia. So the risk is very low. And most reports of adverse reactions are a result of pretty dumb people doing pretty stupid things that are vying for the coveted Darwin Award. Hopefully you know about the Darwin Award, people who attempt to take themselves out of the gene pool, people who try to drink it. You don't do that. Put it on their food, apply it every 10 minutes. You don't do that. So think about that adverse reaction of 1 to 100 million. And let's put that in context of risk of other activities. In this case, I'm comparing the risk of adverse reaction, 1 in 100 million, to the risk of death. So the risk of death from a shark attack or the risk of death via a shark attack is 1 in 8 million. Yet we hear every single one. It makes a lot of noise, doesn't it? But this might surprise you that the risk of death from kangaroo attack is 1 in 8 million as well. We tend not to hear about them very often. Kangaroos are too cute. I think sharks are cuter, but that's my opinion. Marathon runs, deadly, deadly task. 7 in 1 million risk of death. Wow. And think how many deaths you've heard in the, Sydney, the old fun runs in Sydney to Bondi. If you drive 400 kilometers in a car, the risk of death is 1 in 1 million. In fact, if you drive 4 kilometers in a car, the risk of death is 1 in 100 million. And remember, this is saying it's 1 in 100 million for the adverse reaction from use of DEET. On average, people drive a day between 20 and 80 kilometers. And I find it amazing that people worry about DEET when they couldn't give 2 hoots about jumping in the car and driving down to local shops. But interestingly, that the so-called natural, that many of the essential oils pose a far greater health risk. There's lots of adverse reactions to things like tea tree oil, citronella, and they pose a much greater risk. But I would always recommend that you always read the label and follow the instructions. As we say, read and heed the label. I mentioned one method of tick avoidance is using repellents. The other way, and the more effective mean, is using permethrin impregnating clothing. Permethrin actually kills the tick. It's not a repellent as such. So the ticks will still walk onto your clothing, but when they come in contact with the treated clothing, they'll basically die. And there's two forms of permethrin impregnated clothing. There's a do-it-yourself, where you go to, I don't know, Anaconda or one of those, Kathmandu, you buy a little kit, and in the kit there's like a glove, there's a pipette, I think it's 5 mils of permethrin, and you get a bucket, you put so much of that permethrin in a bucket, fill the 5 litres, and soak your clothing in there for so long, I can't remember the length of time. Follow the instructions, it tells you what to do. And the other form is that you buy the clothes already pre-impregnated. And you can buy this clothing in those outdoor stores. Studies have shown, and we've done this work in the laboratory against Ixodes holocyclus. It's published, it's out there. But our studies have shown that the impregnated fabrics, so the ones that you buy from the shop already impregnated, provides better protection than the do-it-yourself form, but also survives more washes. And so you can wash the clothing, but every time you wash your clothing, you do wash some of the permethrin out. So if I was to be honest, if you don't wash your clothing and keep your smelly bush gen clothing for the outdoors and don't wash it too often, it's not a bad idea. Hopefully you're out in the environment, nobody's too close to smell you, but the permethrin will stay in the clothing much longer. But you can get 10 to 20 washes okay before you get appreciable degradation of the permethrin in the impregnated fabric. After about 10 washes, you start losing a lot more with the DIY product, in which case you want to reapply it. There's less environmental impacts because you've got to throw it away and you've got to throw it down the drain. What else can you do with it? The best thing would be do is throw it on cement anyway, so it'll help break it down pretty quickly. But we know that permethrin impregnated clothing provides better protection than repellents, and that's what armies do around the world. They use permethrin impregnated clothing. They'll also use repellents to prevent not only tick bite, but also mosquito bites. So let's move on to tick removal, and there's so many anecdotes about how to remove ticks. And one of the greatest anecdotes, which is not based in one iota of science, is that you need to remove the head. No, you do not. Let's have a close look at the head of a tick. So here we've got the head of a tick. This is actually Ixodes trichocerai. It's a possum tick. You can tell because of the pointed hypostome. So this is called the hypostome, that central structure. And you can see those backward pointing barbs. So inside the structure is basically 2 sharp blades, and the blade cuts and drags the hypostome in. And with those backward pointing barbs, it's basically means a tick's very hard to lodge. And if you forcibly remove a tick, you will always break off the hypostome. It will always be left in the skin. I've never, ever seen it removed. But is that a problem? It's not a problem at all, because as the tick skin naturally sheds, naturally sloughs, eventually this will just drop out of the skin with the, as the skin naturally sheds. On either side of the hypostome, that central structure, 2 sensory structures called palps that are folded out the way. But it's only this part that is inserted into the skin. It's only that part of the head. And the head doesn't contain a salivary glands. It's saliva that you need to worry about. And the salivary glands are in the body. So the head is basically the needle, whereas the syringe is in the body. So it doesn't matter if you leave a bit of the head behind in the body, it will drop off. However, as I said, only the hypostome is inserted, but you can have local allergic reactions and swelling such that it appears a tick has actually burrowed. So here's another colleague of mine who used to work around the corner from me, actually, and he's had a local allergic reaction where the skin's swollen up, where you can't actually see the front pairs of this adult paralysis tick. But we see some really bad methods of tick removal. I mentioned before about that dubious method involving the loop. Well, some people say you can get a string of cotton, form a loop, or nylon fishing line, put it around the tick, squeeze it tight, and pull it out. Well, yes, you can pull it out. You notice the hypostome's broken. But the thing is, what are you doing? You're squeezing the guts out of the tick, and all it's going to do is go while you're pulling it out. If you've got a child with late-stage paralysis, you will kill that child. If you have a patient or a family member that suffer severe anaphylactic reaction, you will give them an anaphylactic reaction. This is one of the most dangerous things that you can do to remove the tick. The other method sometimes we see, and we see it particularly in GPs who come from overseas, who's never been exposed to tick, and they surgically remove it. They cut a chunk of flesh out. That is butchery, absolute butchery, in my opinion. There's just no need to do this. And there's no need to cause so much pain and discomfort to patients. There's no need to do this. So in the past, common tick advice was to basically use fine tip tweezers, such as we see in the bottom right. They are jeweler's tweezers. You grab the tick as close to the skin and lever it out and remove as soon as possible. There's lots of problems with this method. Nobody has the right pairs of tweezers, unless you're an entomologist or a jeweler. So the wrong tweezers are always used, and the result, as the tick is grasped by the body is squeezed, causing an injection of basically all the nasty stuff. And it's so rarely done properly. And if it's not done properly, as I said, it is dangerous. And in reality, there's little science around this method. It's relevant to information for ticks overseas, but it's not relevant to the Australian ticks, where basically paralysis and allergic reactions are the problem. Now, in Northern America, if a tick's got the Lyme disease pathogen, if it's ticks removed in 24 to 48 hours, it's less likely to pass on the pathogen. So removing the tick in Northern Hemisphere is a great idea, and it's great advice. But we need scientific-based advice based around the intended target species, in this case, the Australian paralysis tick. And so the advice of removing ticks with tweezers is not relevant here. And so a group called the Australian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy, which basically composes of all your clinical allergists, your staff specialists, your immunologists, they formed these recommendations, and they followed on recommendations from Bernie Stone, a name I mentioned earlier, who was a great scientist and basically developed this guideline back in the 90s. Basically, you do not touch the tick. You avoid touching the tick, and you kill it where it is. So you kill it in situ, in place. You either use an ether-based spray and you freeze it, such as Tick Off, and there's others on the market. This slide's a few years old. And then you wait for the tick to drop off, or you leave for several hours, and then you can remove it. Now, if you do, or your family member that you're doing it through this, or your friend or your staff member, do suffer tick anaphylaxis, and you want to ask them if they do suffer from this before it's ever attempted. If they do suffer from anaphylaxis, go to a safe setting. And a safe setting is a doctor's waiting room, an emergency department waiting room. Do it there. So if you've got or develop an anaphylaxis, where you get immediate treatment. And for the tiny larval stage and the nymphal stage, you can use permethrin cream. So if you go to the pharmacy, you can buy Lyclear, 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 used for scabies treatment. You can buy it across the counter. I can't remember how much it is, at $15 to $20. You don't need a prescription. You can buy it over the counter. And we use and recommend that for the nymphs and the larval stage, which are a bit harder to kill with the spray. The good thing is that we have clinical evidence to show this method actually works and reduces the risk of adverse clinical reaction. In a prospective study, the prospective study is one that looks to the future, that was undertaken at Mona Vale Hospital before the emergency department was moved to Northern Beaches. Colleagues of mine who are actually involved in Tiara compared the risk of adverse health impacts in patients who removed ticks via tweezers compared to those that killed the tick in place first. 50 patients reported attempting to remove ticks via the use of tweezers. An astonishing 86%, almost 90%, almost 9 out of every 10 developed an allergic reaction, and 2 of those had severe anaphylactic reaction. So we're saying 4%. That's quite a significant number. And so they're at the risk of death. Whereas 61 patients who killed the tick in place using either the ether-based sprays or permethrin, only 5% had an allergic reaction and none had an anaphylactic reaction. This has been published. The results are clear-cut. This is a way to remove the tick. And if you want to see a superb animation of how to properly remove or kill a tick in place and to remove it, go to the Tiara website and scroll down the main page, keep scroll down until you see this very screen, this blue screen. It won't have the letters Tiara on it, but that's just there for the web. And basically it shows you with the ether-based sprays, those that you can buy from the chemist there, somewhere about $20. And if you're a bush gen, always have some, keep them with you. Maybe not in the car. You don't want the car to get too hot. These are flammable. And basically you hold the spray 1 centimeter above the tick and you give it 5 sprays. Now, I was on the radio, I was on Simon Marnie's program just not long back on 2BL in the mornings on Saturday. And somebody rang up and said, I used this stuff and I got burnt. I said, well, how many sprays did you do? Oh, about 20 or 30. Read the directions, please. It says 5 sprays. But do watch the video. And I think if anybody does bush gen, I mean, make it part of your training. Hey, Scott, do this for your staff. Part of your risk assessment is that they watch this video before they go out and do bush gen. It makes sense to me. It'd be something I would recommend as a manager. Not that I'm telling you to do your work. Well, I am really, but it's but it's just good advice. And so Cheryl Van Noonen, the great Cheryl Van Noonen, developed these slogans: freeze, don't squeeze; dab it, don't grab it; and household tweezers are tick squeezers. And finally, because Lyme disease has been so controversial and it doesn't exist in Australia, and if you want to read more reasons why it doesn't exist in Australia, there's all these papers here. I'll let Andrew send them to you, send the information on them and details of them if you're really after them. So with that, I'm done. So I will close off my screen and maybe I will stop sharing.
That's great, Stephen.
Sorry, new share. I don't want new share. I can't even see stop sharing with this, but anyway, if we can go to the chat, once I work out.
If you go to the top of the screen,
yeah,
right at the top of the screen.
Yeah, oh yes, here we are. Okay.
Yep.
So let's scroll up to the questions. Have we got to
stop?
Well, somebody said.
So you're still sharing, Stephen. So if you just go to the top of the pages in green.
Okay, I'll just
right.
quickly go through some. Somebody said Lyme disease exists here. Why wouldn't it? Well, one, we don't have the vector. It does not exist here. There's been a bucket of research undertaken. There's zero evidence to occur here. It does not occur here. Zero evidence. Is there a chance someone may not realize they've been bitten by a tick and not know to kill it? Of course. And we know that particularly children tend not to react quite as much to ticks. And every couple of years we have cases of tick paralysis in children. And I remember one case in the children's hospital here at Westmead, not long after it opened, there was a young girl who was in deep paralysis. She was on life support and the doctors thought, no, she's not going to make it. No chance. We just don't know why she's dying. And it was only in a moment of tenderness where this nurse was just patting her hair in a moment of sympathy, that she felt this lump. I thought, that's strange. Looked at it and it was a tick. Tick was removed and the child recovered. If I lack the right equipment, is it safe to leave the tick in place? Yes. So yes. So preemptive measures would be to have one of these or have some cream in your safety kit and your first aid kit. But I mean, we're never far from a chemist. I mean, unless you're bushwalking miles out in the bush. If you're miles out in the bush and it's 2 or 3 days before you come back, that's a tough one. I would say make sure you take the stuff with you, just some permethrin cream. I mean, it doesn't weigh much. I mean, I would take the permethrin cream. But if you're just bush genning in Sydney or the Sydney region, leave it in place until you go to the pharmacy or you go to a medical profession. What about putting peppermint oil on a tick? No. I mean, there's so many products that have been suggested. Vaseline, you name it. And so many of these can cause the tick to basically spit its guts out. And you don't want that, spit its guts, spit its saliva, and that can lead to an increase risk of actually causing an adverse reaction. Okay, does permethrin hurt other insects in contact with it? Well, yes, permethrin is an insecticide. So yes, and that's one advantage of wearing permethrin impregnated clothing. It's done in the company, it's already done. You don't have to dispose of excess permethrin. But if you're just wearing it, it stays pretty well on the clothing until you wash it off. So the chances of other insects coming in contact with it's pretty slim, but it's an insecticide. So yes, and that's the same with if you're spraying your backyard with a product like permethrin. You're going to kill every invertebrate in the backyard. I mean, you can kill bees, you can kill everything. So you've got to think about the environmental consequence of these things too. So be aware of that. I can just provide the advice. I mean, in many countries, they use fire to control ticks. Do we want to do that in Australia? No. Hairspray nail polish remover. No, don't. I was told that hairspray smother and kill them. Old bushman's tale, old bushman's, old bush lady's tale. Yes, do not
That's
use.
one of the volunteers asking that.
Brenda
Brenda.
Park. No, Brenda, don't do it. Use the science-based method. As I said, there's lots of myths and legends around ticks. Use what we know and has been proven in a clinical setting to actually work. What's the treatment for scrubbage? Well, scrubbage is a term that's used for different things for different creatures. But in the context of larval ticks, if the larval tick is still attached, then put the permethrin on the tick. Fortunately, larval ticks, there's a low risk of adverse reactions, or severe adverse reactions, because they haven't picked up a pathogen or not likely to have picked up a pathogen. They can be passed from the eggs to the juvenile stage. But because they haven't actually fed on an animal, they haven't picked up the alpha-gal carbohydrate, so they can't pass on alpha-gal to you. And because they're so tiny, they're not going to cause paralysis. So you can dab them with the permethrin cream. But once they're dead, you're going to still have a itchy spot. Then you can, I'm not a clinician, but you can use your antihistamines and local topical creams to relieve the itch, and just go to your pharmacy or to your doctor for proper medical advice. And of course, if you have any more severe adverse reaction, go to your GP. Do the antibiotics prevent the meat allergy from developing after a bite? No. Antibiotics are used to combat largely bacterial or rickettsial diseases. It's neither. So it's not going to do anything. You're so funny, Stephen. Oh, thank you, Andrew. That's very kind of you. What about overhanging branches of gum trees? Do they live in gum trees? No, they don't climb up high in the vegetation. Now, all that research I showed that they don't tend to climb more than about 1/2 meter. That's research that's been done basically on exodes overseas. It's not being done here, but there's no indication. And I've done a lot of tick collecting over the years. I don't collect trees because I know they're down on the ground. That's where I'm going to get them. It's not to say occasionally they don't climb higher, but that would be very rare. They're going to be lower to the ground. I mean, if I go tick collecting these days, I only apply spray to my knees and down. This is me. I'm trying to avoid repellents on my equipment. When I've done that, I've never actually had a tick on me ever, and I've collected a lot of ticks. Does permethrin? Oh, we said that ticks carry Q fever. Well, that's the disease I was. Well, that's Coxiella. So there's suggestions that ticks transmit Coccinella burnettii. I mean, you're more likely to get it through other means, through aerosols, particularly if you're at work in a abattoir. There's still a lot of doubts about ticks carrying Q fever. It's suggested, but I've never seen one good bit of evidence suggest they do. Q fever is, well, the rickets is highly infectious. And like I said, if you're a meat worker or in some other areas, you're more likely to get that. But there are vaccines available, which is good. Would be allergic to milk as well as lactose. I'm not aware of any allergy to milk, but I will ask Professor Cheryl Van Noonen whether any patients suffer milk allergies as well, but I'm not aware of it. Does getting more ticks over time make one immune to the tick bite? Well, that's a good question, because it's like any insect or arthropods that bite. You can go one of two ways. You become hypersensitive or you can become immune. And generally, most people become hypersensitive. The more ticks you get on, the more likely to develop a severe reaction. But you can develop an immunity. To give an indication, when I started in entomology in 1985 at Sydney University, everybody in the laboratory at the time were feeding mosquitoes on themselves to maintain them in a colony. And so the cages had maybe 2,000 to 3,000 mosquitoes. And I thought, as a young entomologist, seeing these people do it, I thought, well, I'll give it a go. Put your arm in a cage of mosquitoes, 2,000 mosquitoes feed on you. I didn't sleep at all for about 2 nights because I just kept itching. But I did feed the mosquitoes weekly thereafter. And after 1 year, I developed immunity. But I'm not saying go out in the bush and let yourself get covered in tick bites. That would be pretty stupid. It's just saying that you can go 2 ways. You can become hypersensitive and very allergic, but for some insects, and basically how you build up, if you do become hypersensitive, you can go through a desensitization process where you're basically given little amounts of the toxin, and then that increases over time. So I've done that for, say, grass pollens to reduce my grass allergies. Didn't work very long, sadly, but anyway. What are the preventive medications available for my dog? Sorry, I'm not a vet. I'll let the vets answer that. Yet nothing for humans. Correct. There is nothing for humans. Your preventive medicines are your DEETs, your repellents, and your permethrin impregnated clothing. They are registered by the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority. And never go to some backyard market where they're selling repellents. If they're selling repellents, look at the product and you'll see somewhere on the label, and it's a legal document, it will say APVMA approval number. Look for that. If it hasn't got that, it hasn't been assessed for both safety and efficacy, and don't use it.
Stephen, we've got about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So, and there's new questions down the bottom.
Oh, down the bottom. Okay, we'll scroll. Somebody said, how do ticks cause Lyme disease? Well, in the Northern Hemisphere, they carry a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi, and there's various others that belong to that group. The ticks pass on that bacteria. The bacteria then affect you, and that causes the disease. Is there much risk of foreign ticks becoming established in Australia, or Australian ticks becoming established overseas? It's a good question. We've had a number of patients come back into Australia with ticks from overseas, and a number of dogs too. So we've had those Lyme disease vectors, the Ixodes rusti and Ixodes scapularis, but we've never seen them established. Generally, people will find the tick on them, and they'll be removed. But because people don't go out and live in the bush, out in the great wilderness, the tick's not likely to drop off outdoors. So the chances of a tick on a person, well, it happens. We see a couple of cases every year, but them getting established out in the environment is highly unlikely. Having said that, we have exotic tick species in Australia, and they've been brought in on livestock, on cattle. And that is a way how exotic ticks could be brought in via animals. However, we have quarantine processes in place to reduce the incidence. And if you're bringing your dog in from overseas, it has to have a veterinary certificate. It has to be treated with certain anti-parasitic compounds. So the chances of exotic ticks coming in is very low, I would expect.
There was a related question, the very first one. A lady
Oh,
saying my tick bite occurred in Botswana, bullseye
oh
fever.
yeah.
Is this the same as what you see in Sydney?
In Africa, you're more likely bitten by a Haemaphysalis. Bites from Haemaphysalis in Australia are quite different. People talk about a bullseye rash, which is associated with Lyme disease, and people will actually get similar sort of reactions from just tick bites in Australia too. There are common allergic style reactions, no matter whether it's a tick or a mosquito or a bed bug. I mean, we get these allergic reactions. In the case of Africa, there's different diseases that are over there. So without knowing more specific information, I couldn't tell you. I mean, whether it's related to a pathogen or just allergic reaction, that's very difficult to say just on even just a bite alone. Sorry, what else we got? By eating kangaroo meat, can you reduce your chance of a severe bite reaction? No, because the meat is a protein and you're getting past the carbohydrate. I've never heard of that, but it's actually an interesting question, and I will run that by Cheryl when I will ask her. Oh, well, okay, one by Jay. I missed the first part of the presence. I think I got a tiny tick bite a few months back, like the size of an inside grown hair, which will pulled out with tweezers, which I know is bad. Are there any issues I could still face without knowing it? Probably not. I mean, it's unlikely. You said it's some months back. So if you haven't developed a clinic reaction by now, I think the chances of you getting anything is 0, to be honest. Oh, there's a really good question here, and I do like this one. Why don't health authorities take rickettsia and other recognised tick-borne diseases seriously and educate the public around them? Well, there's 2 parts to this question. Tiara was established for this very reason, because health authorities around Australia don't do this. I mean, there is information on the Federal Department of Health. There's very little on state health. They refer to the federal health. But the disease rickettsia is not what we call a notifiable disease, whereas mosquito-borne disease like Ross River, a very common disease, is notifiable. So we don't really know how many cases are diagnosed every year or where the case is occurring. And a few years ago when I was writing up a paper, I wanted to try to determine how many cases there were occurring in Australia. So I rang up the main testing laboratories, and there's probably about 200 cases every year, which is a lot more than I actually thought. So it's not notifiable. So and that person who's asking the question is right. And there hasn't been a lot of work. So the federal government has recently spent a huge amount of money producing these ridiculous, and I have to say ridiculous fact sheets, which some are going 40, 50 pages, which contain information for general practitioners, which are totally irrelevant. I mean, it's just not much good. Whereas I think the best information out there at the moment is on the Tiara website, and it's the best information by far. It's simplistic, it's easy to read, and it's good information, and it's information based on science.
Stephen, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're about to be kicked out of the office.
Oh.
The cleaner said 8 o'clock. Out.
They're vicious, those cleaners in Norway, aren't they?
Yeah.
They got a lot of power.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking with us. It's been a very interesting presentation, and thanks for letting us record this presentation, and I'll be able to circulate it throughout the bushcare community. And like I said in the chat, we'll put it in our electronic newsletter. And yeah, just thank you very much. And it was really entertaining and interesting. And I hope that information is useful for the community and prevents any possible health issues.
Oh, thank you, Andrew, and appreciate being invited. And remember that they are quite beautiful and quite nasty creatures in many ways, but I quite like them. They're a sign of a healthy environment. If you've got ticks, you know you've got animals, you've got a good environment. So and to me, they're a bit of an environmental indicator of good environment. So I sort of like them in a way because of that, despite the adverse reactions.
Thanks, Stephen. Good night, everyone.
Night, everyone. Bye.